What's the word, peoples? It's your boy John back at y'all with another reaction video. This is what will happen after World War III. Man, that is a good question. I mean, will people survive? I mean, I'm sure some people will survive, though, but, you know, the aftermath of it all, the radiation, I don't know, man. Ain't no telling what will happen. It's just going to be a real sad day on this planet. Well, sad years to come on this planet, but I just pray that nothing like this will happen. We know we're on the verge of it. Hopefully, people will get their minds together and figure out that all this is it's really not necessary, or it'll be dumb to do. Because once one side shoots, the other side shoots. You end up killing yourself in the long run anyway. You ain't gonna be able to survive in them bunkers at all. But hey, it's neither here nor there with me. Let's go ahead and get into this reaction video.
This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, the free online strategy game where you'll bring the most modern technology to the battlefield. Take control of a real country to find out what it's like to lead it in a modern global warfare in real-time games that can take weeks to complete. As you field armies filled with over 100 beautifully modeled modern weapon systems. There's everything from combat attack helicopters and airborne infantry units to stealth fighters and even nuclear ballistic submarines. And it's not just the models that are realistic. I absolutely love how they move across the map at a realistic speed, something that can take hours, giving me time to think about my tactics and create deep strategic plans. Infographics show viewers get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free when they use the link, but it's only available for 30 days, so click the link, choose a country, and start fighting your way to victory right now. The unthinkable has happened, and military forces clash on land, in the air, and on the sea, and underneath it, in the most violent war to date. But what would actually happen after World War III? The probability of a third world war is negligible but not impossible. All three of these big military powers who have the capability to launch a global war all have too much to lose by doing so. But history is full of examples of small conflicts spiraling completely out of control and beyond the plans of those who initiated them. To find out what the world would look like after World War III, we have to examine two different global wars, a conventional war and a nuclear war. One thing is for sure, the economic damage alone would reshape the face of the earth. Such a war would inevitably begin by a confrontation between US and Chinese forces in the South or East China Sea. A Sino-US war isn't likely to go global and would require multiple escalatory steps to get there. First, China would have to directly threaten or attack Japanese forces, something that is predisposed to do already because of the presence of multiple US air bases in Japan. If China wanted to keep Japan out of the conflict, it would have to avoid striking these bases, which would have seriously detrimental effects on its ability to fight against the US. Next, a third party would have to be willing to exploit the situation to its own advantage. The most likely culprits here are India, Iran, and Russia. India would be tempted to act to push Chinese ground forces out of the contested northern border regions and perhaps even maneuver itself to throw China out of Tibet, thus threatening Chinese freshwater supplies and granting it massive leverage over its rival. That's unlikely but not impossible, as a Sino-American war would largely be fought at the sea and in the air, leaving the People's Liberation Army free to fight against Indian incursion. Iran, however, is likely to exploit the diversion of US forces from the region for its own gain. A war between the US and China would inevitably cause a drawdown of US peacekeeping forces in other regions of the world. Currently, 60% of US firepower is in the Pacific, but as losses rapidly mount, the US will need to pull reinforcements from its multiple other global commands. With American forces no longer acting as police against bad actors, Iran could use the opportunity to attack Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states with its superior military. This would hugely disrupt global oil trade and have devastating financial repercussions across the world. Russia might seek to exploit US preoccupation with China for its own gain in Europe. While Russia has no ambition to rule all of Europe, it could see a drawdown of US forces in Europe as the opportunity to take by force breakaway Soviet republics and even some of its NATO neighbors such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. In a worst-case scenario, all three flashpoints are ignited due to American preoccupation with China, leaving the world dramatically different after the war. Such a war is almost certain to end with a US victory over China, although an extremely costly and poorly defined victory. Immediately at war's end, the United States military would be severely depleted, going from the world's most powerful fighting force to a significantly weakened force that still has global reach, but will take a decade or more to restore itself to its former glory. American naval and air losses would be staggering, as with much of half of its air and naval fleets destroyed. Half of the U.S. aircraft carrier fleet would be sunk in a conflict with China, a loss of over $50 billion in ship costs alone, over 500 aircraft and over 12,000 seamen and aviators. The loss of all important American carriers alone would see the United States lose its ability to rapidly respond to global conflicts. This loss in capability would only be compounded by significant losses in the U.S. Air Force. Without the ability to rapidly and overwhelmingly respond to global crises, the immediate post-war years would see an ignition of regional wars across Africa and the Middle East. Critics of U.S. military presence around the world would rapidly see the cost of losing that peacekeeping force as simmering tensions suddenly explode in the absence of a threat of U.S. involvement. In the Middle East, Iran would seize the opportunity to attack its longtime rival Saudi Arabia. Despite being an oil-rich and wealthy nation, Saudi Arabia is handily outclassed militarily by Iran, as it has relied on the United States to keep Iran in check for decades. No other power is likely to prevent Iranian aggression in the Middle East, nor do they have the capability to do so. All European powers, save for France, simply no longer have the expeditionary capabilities to respond to military conflicts around the world without U.S. support, and France lacks the assets needed to significantly counter Iranian aggression so far from its own shores. An oil-rich Iran would become a regional superpower, shaping the Middle Eastern policy to its own liking. This would inevitably lead to an explosion of extremism, with waves of attacks against Europe and African nations, launching both continents into a dark age of terrorism. Enriched by Saudi Arabian wealth and oil fields, Iran could continue a campaign of conquest unchecked across the Middle East, forcing other neighboring nations into its fold and simply invading those that resisted. With its finger firmly on the oil tap to Europe, Iran would have great influence over European powers, likely leading to a necessary buildup of military forces in Europe and an inevitable invasion of the Middle East years later. A European Middle East war would be a world war in its own right, with staggering casualties on all sides and economically ruinous for both regions. Middle East turmoil would only make the lives of those in China worse. In the aftermath of a war against the U.S., the Chinese Navy and Air Force would be obliterated, with only those forces left in reserve in Western China against India or Russian incursions left intact. Chinese infrastructure, at least along its eastern Pacific border, would also suffer moderate damage due to American long-range air attacks, while China can do little to militarily threaten the U.S. homeland. Large-scale damage to Chinese port facilities would only exuberate the damage caused by years of American naval blockade. China relies on the Pacific for the majority of its trade, and most importantly for the import of energy resources. Despite heavy losses, the U.S. Navy could still undertake an effective blockade of Chinese trade, crippling the nation and resulting in a GDP loss of as much as 35%. China, in return, could threaten U.S. trade in the Pacific as well, but would be unable to directly threaten either the American West or East Coast, resulting in only an expected GDP loss of 10% for the U.S. But the disruption of trade in what's the world's most important trade superhighway would only result in the weakening of the East Asian economies and, to a smaller extent, the entire world. East Asian nations would be the hardest hit due to their dependence on Chinese goods. This will have a knock-on effect on European nations who import cheap goods manufactured in East Asia. The ensuing worldwide economic recession will lead to flare-ups in social unrest and widespread unemployment. This, combined with a worst-case scenario of Iranian aggression in the Middle East, could set the stage for
unemployment, food shortages. I mean, it's already in the making right now. You can see it right now. Food shortages is definitely skyrocketing. Gas prices skyrocketing. Unemployment still like it is. I mean, it's been like that for a minute, but and then it's like they just got rid of the whole coronavirus thing. That just disappeared, I guess. I don't know what's going on with that. It's just, man, this is crazy. We living in some real rough times now. And it's only going to get worse.
Movements in some countries and the flare-up of partisan tension spilling over into outright violence. Perhaps no nation would be as rocked, though, as China, who, despite inflicting incredible losses on the U.S. military, would still be facing a humiliating defeat, with a near total loss of its Navy and Air Force. American cyber warfare operations would work to steadily degrade the Chinese government's ability to censor information electronically throughout the nation, and increasing unrest and war weariness would embolden pro-democracy and separatist factions in China. While it's likely that the Chinese government government would remain intact, this would represent a significant threat to the Chinese Communist Party, directly leading to even more violent crackdowns on an increasingly rebellious population. We've already seen this scenario in miniature thanks to the Hong Kong riots, and while China showed restraint in Hong Kong because of international pressure, it's unlikely to show restraint when faced with similar uprisings within the mainland when the survival of the CCP is threatened. The further disruption of the Chinese economy would have a domino effect on the rest of the world, especially those nations that rely on China for critical technology and imports. Global GDP would shrink significantly, leading to unemployment and unrest across the world. While the rest of the world is suffering, though, one nation might come out of a third world war smelling like roses. Russia has long suffered under a weakening economy, made worse by European sanctions due to its aggression in Crimea. However, the loss of Chinese trade routes throughout the war and a need by China to replace its destroyed military equipment would be a massive financial boon to the state. European powers might be even willing to lift sanctions against Russia and provide economic concessions or even political ones, such as allowing Russia to reabsorb former Soviet republics in exchange for the aid of the Russian military in fighting against Iranian aggression in the Middle East. A new global order after World War III would see Russia rising to a position of prominence it hasn't held since the days of the Soviet Union. But now let's look at a worst-case scenario, complete and total nuclear warfare that spans the face of the earth. While a conventional World War III would still see the United States suffer the least militarily or economic harm, a nuclear war would almost completely level the playing field between China and the US, leaving both nations a ruined, smoking wreck. The US still holds the advantage in number and sophistication of nuclear weapons, thus China would inevitably suffer far greater damage than the US. However, nearly every major US city would suffer at least one nuclear strike, with most coming under fire from multiple warheads. Should Russia join the fray, it would inevitably pull in nuclear NATO members such as France and Great Britain, and spread thermonuclear warfare across 4 of the world's 7 continents. Previous fears of nuclear winter have since been proven to be overblown, but a global cooling effect will still take place, dropping global temperatures by a few degrees. A drop of just 1 degree centigrade in global temperatures would make Canadian wheat growing impossible, showing us just how vulnerable the global food supply really is. What farmland isn't rendered fallow by a drop in global temperatures would likely be unusable due to nuclear impacts. Both the US and Russia target each other's vast swaths of farmland as nuclear targets, with the express intent of starving each other into submission in case of nuclear war. With the US alone exporting much of the world's grain, it wouldn't just be the Americans that starve, but much of the world as well. Compound that with strikes against Russia and Chinese food-producing regions, plus contamination from other nuclear strikes, and hundreds of millions would begin to starve within weeks. The initial casualties would also be in the hundreds of millions, with hundreds of millions more falling prey to injuries and radiation sickness within days to weeks. Then, secondary effects of global nuclear war would lead to even more deaths, as trade routes are disrupted, infrastructure is rendered inoperable, and diseases caused by high concentration of airborne debris strike down people by the millions. Many nations around the world would rely on imports to feed their populations, and the loss of global trade alone would doom tens of millions to immediate starvation. As massive plumes of choking dust and debris spread across countrysides in Australia, North America, Europe, and Asia, respiratory disease would claim millions more. Global firestorms would decimate wildlands, as fires ignited by burning cities spread for hundreds of miles around, causing fires so fast that they'd be visible from space, if not for all the debris in the atmosphere. If one could peer through that thick haze of gray that would remain aloft for days or even weeks, they would see a planet in flames, with fires raging for weeks or even months and killing millions more. The world population would likely fall to below 1 billion within 5 years of global thermonuclear war. Within a decade of starvation, disease, and conflict for dwindling resources, humanity would be lucky to number in the 500 millions. However, there is good reason to think that humanity would not go extinct after all, and could even bounce back in time. Most nuclear strikes are designed to maximize destruction. A ground burst of nuclear weapon severity limits its destructive range, as most of the energy in the explosion is sent down into the ground or absorbed by ground features such as buildings, hills, etc. Therefore, nuclear weapons are designed to explode over their target, greatly enhancing their lethality and avoiding ground clutter altogether. While this makes nuclear weapons more lethal, it has the positive side effect of sending more of the resulting radiation upwards and into space. Fears of a global irradiated wasteland might be overblown, and while it's certain that radioactive debris would be in harmful levels just about anywhere on Earth, humanity and the livestock and food crops it depends on could still survive in sufficient numbers to eventually bounce back. That's because the fissile material in a bomb is destroyed in milliseconds, causing an intense burst of radioactivity that quickly falls off as atoms decay in a chain reaction. In several years, most radioactive fallout would turn into more stable elements, such as strontium-90. With its half-life of 29 years, strontium-90 and similar materials are still harmful, but not nearly as radioactive as materials with a half-life of hours, minutes, or even seconds. As Nagasaki and Hiroshima have proven, it doesn't take long for humanity to reclaim the ruins of cities struck by nuclear weapons. The real danger is in the sheer number of weapons employed in a global nuclear war, and thus the higher concentration of less dangerous but still harmful, longer-lived radioactive isotopes in the water and soil. Human lifespans will be shortened dramatically, and many species will go extinct due to climate change. Natural ecosystems will collapse, and a staggering amount of pollution will be created by the incineration of hundreds of major cities. Even after all of that, within centuries, humanity should be well on the rebound. What shape the world would take, however, is completely unknown, though it's likely that none of the current major powers would continue to exist as cohesive states. In all likelihood, it would be Africa which would become the lotus of economic and military power, as it's least likely to be directly affected by nuclear war, and unlike the rest of the world, they'd still be able to feed most of their population, as many African states have agrarian-based economies. One thing is certain, the nations that launched World War III would not be much more than dust, and utterly inconsequential in the new era of human history to come. Thanks again to our sponsor, Conflict of Nations, the free
Damn, man. World we live in. You know, when regular people like me and you, we don't have a say-so in none of it. None of it. It's all just the politicians and dictators all over the world that just pick and choose what's best for us when we don't even agree to it. But let us all pray that nothing like this happens. Everybody live a peaceful life. I'm gonna get at y'all later. Peace.